Tonight we're going to be talking about the violation of the pattern of the work of the church in preaching the gospel. All who are Bible believers know that the Lord gave the Great Commission and said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Mark 16 and verse 15. Likewise, we know that the church is the pillar and ground of the truth. 1 Timothy 3:15. Furthermore, we know that the church is to sound out the word of the Lord. 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 8. And that part of the work of the church is that of building itself up by preaching the gospel. Ephesians 4:11 through 16 we talked about last week. These and other scriptures set before our minds the work that God has assigned to the church of preaching the gospel. And the scripture says, they that preach the gospel should live of the gospel. 1 Corinthians 9th chapter. And we also learned that when a church or churches did support preaching, that they gave to the preacher directly. This is what we've learned. So tonight we have several charts here, some new ones I've made today. I got thinking about it, so I made some new ones up. We're going to look at some of these and see what the issue, first of all, was not in the time past, what the issue is not today. Now, as we begin to note this, what the issue was not before, that is in the work of evangelism in years past, when the Missionary Society arose, it was not should the gospel be preached. That was not what we were talking about. It was not was the church to support the preaching of the gospel. We've already proven that. It was not could churches cooperate in the work of preaching. We've shown that. Or could a place be provided and maintained? Not simply a matter of how. A systematic arrangement and method. Now note these things were not the issue of which churches sending support to missionary societies or human organizations divided 100 and over 50 years ago. In fact, about 180 years ago, almost 130 years ago now, I guess it is. 1849 is when the first missionary society came about. And then later, churches began to call for and receive contributions from, or colleges began to call for and receive contributions from churches. And I have an old annual put out in 19 and about 32 or 3 that was left at the house, Nicholson's house, and it was the time when the college was still over at Morrilton before it moved to Searcy in 1936. In this annual, the college annual, there are several different times in the annual which they're asking for churches to support the college, way back there. It's not a new issue. Alexander Campbell called for it, and they supported Bethany College. Lipscomb was against it, but after his death, brethren began to support David Lipscomb College. Harding College asked for, and Brother George Benson, in his last letter, I receive one every month, the alumni, he's asking for churches to send money to him as a missionary society, and he'll send overseas for them to build a college or school over there. So he's asking for this, and I have it all on file. So this is going on today, and yet back when Foy Wallace talked about the matter in the 30s, and Brother Benson took over the college in 36, he said at that time that he wouldn't take money from churches, but now he's begging for it. Then he wouldn't take it, but now begging for it. So George has changed his tune, hasn't he? You see that? All right? So the work of edification, teaching our children the Bible, should members be edified? Was the church to furnish edification for the members? Could churches cooperate in the work of edification? Could a place be provided and maintained? Not simply a matter of how, systematic arrangement or method, but these things were not the issue of which churches and colleges support the college whose organizations began to have trouble several years ago. All right, now then, that is not the problem then. Let's look at, next of all, what the issues are parallel, what it was then and what is today, or the problem is today. The issue was 130 years ago, or a little over, in evangelism, could local churches support, that is, help build and maintain missionary societies through which to do their work of evangelism? Now note, this was the real issue then. It caused trouble In fact, it caused the church to divide, and the Christian church stand today as a result of this problem. Edification. Could local churches support, help build and maintain schools and colleges through which to do their work of edification? Now, this was the real issue then. It caused trouble back in the 30s. It is now with us again, and brethren are having trouble with it now. And it'll continue to be a sore spot as long as this thing continues. All right? Now, last week we noticed the pattern that the Lord has given for supporting the preaching of the gospel, and briefly here it is. The pattern for preaching. You remember that Paul was down at Philippi, or went to Thessalonica. The church at Philippi sent washed and again to his necessities. It's in 4:15 through 17. It was direct. There was no in the middle or in between organization or sponsoring church between the church sending the support and Paul receiving it for preaching on another field. And here the churches of Macedonia, they supplied what Paul needed while at Corinth. 2 Corinthians 11, 7 through 9, he robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. So here again, it was direct support from several churches directed to Paul, and no in-between or in-the-middle organization, even organization or sponsoring church to do the work. Now that is and was the pattern in the first century, and still is the pattern today. Now note the violation of the pattern. How the pattern has been violated by many people. First of all, let's look at the Missionary Society plan for just a moment and see how that this has been violated. The Missionary Society plan was simply for local churches of Christ to send their funds, their money, and their oversight and their work of preaching, turn the work of preaching over to a man-made body. Other than the one body, the church, they gave it to another body, the missionary body or society. And that's exactly what a society is. It's a body politic, separate apart from others. And they turned their work of preaching, and they turned their oversight of preaching, and turned the funds of preaching, and they themselves selected the preacher and sent the preacher out. Well, the sponsoring church plan that began after World War II among churches of Christ, you remember the Lubbock plan was to preach the gospel, and they were preaching the gospel, you recall, in that day and time, in Germany. They sent Otis Gatewood, while Norval Young was the preaching there. They sent Otis Gatewood to Germany along with others, and so they asked for churches of Christ to give them the work of preaching. They assumed the work of preaching in Germany, and so they wanted the oversight, and they wanted your money, and then they took your money and hired preachers and sent them to Germany to preach the gospel. I ask of you, what is the difference in principle between the man-made missionary society and the man-made sponsoring church society? I wouldn't turn around and give you a plug nickel difference between them, would you? And then again, Highland, after a while, in 1952, I was living at Conway at the time, and the first Sunday it came on, I was over at Herman Keller's house, and Herman said, let's listen to E.R. Harper today, and he comes on the Herald of Truth. We were all just anticipating, because we all knew E.R. Harper so well. He was raised in this area, so we listened to the great big ears. And after a few weeks went by, one day we were going out taking care of an insurance claim. Herman said, Glenn, said, I've just been wondering, I think H.S. had put a little bug in his ear, but he said, Glenn, I've just been wondering, where is the Bible authority for all these churches to send their money to Highland and for them to do the work of preaching for the churches? I said, I don't know, Herman, I'll sure get it for you. I haven't got it yet, because it can't be gotten. That's why. I couldn't find it. And that's when right then I saw in the next year, in 1953, I held a meeting in Paris, Arkansas, and preached my first sermon against the Herald of Truth. It's on record. So I began the first year after it started to begin to oppose it because I couldn't find Bible authority for it. So Highland Church here, the Highland Church, you might pull over for me a little bit, Bill. I'm going the wrong way on it. The Highland Church asked them for the churches to send money to them, and they put on the program. In the bill, asked where is the scripture authority for these plans? Any of these three. Now, if they get authority for this one, I'm sure we can get it for the other two. I've asked for book, chapter, and verse, and I've said before, the only authority I've ever received, as Guy Wood said in a speech at Garfield Heights in Indianapolis, Indiana, he says, there is no pattern for preach the gospel. The Lord said, go preach, and didn't tell us how. That's the same argument that Alexander Campbell said in the 1840s. The Lord said, go preach, and didn't tell us how, so let's start a missionary society. The argument for the sponsoring church of Highland and all the others is the same argument that Alexander Campbell made for the missionary society. And when Brother Yater Tan had the debate with E.R. Harper, he said in the very first speech, he said, every argument that E.R. Harper will make in this debate will be found in the writings of such men as Alexander Campbell in support of the missionary society. And that's exactly what E.R. Harper had to do. He couldn't make otherwise. He said the arguments I will make will be like Tolbert Fanning, David Lipscomb, and preachers like that who oppose the missionary society. All the arguments I make will be after their arguments. That's where I got them. That's what I had the debate to turn out. All right? Now then, here is the pattern, New Testament pattern, we mentioned last week. Briefly we mentioned again. New Testament pattern, the local church to select the preacher. Local church defined the territory of labor. Local church sent the preacher out. The local church paid the preacher. Local church paid directly to the preacher on the field. The local church received a report directly from the preacher sent out. Now this is New Testament authority for this practice. We have authority. The Missionary Society plan, they selected the preacher. They defined the territory of labor. The Missionary Society sent the preacher out. They also paid the preacher. They received from local churches they begged for, and it was thus sent indirectly from churches to the Missionary Society to the preacher. The Missionary Society received the report directly from the preacher on the field, and then turned around and reported to the contributing churches indirectly from the preacher to the Missionary Society to the churches. Now, where in New Testament authority for this practice? The whole thing revolves on where is the Bible authority. That's all you have to find. It is what is the book, as Herman said, Glenn, where is the book, chapter, and verse? And I couldn't find it for Herman, and I haven't found anybody in the debate could find it for me either, because it just ain't there. Then again, the sponsoring church plan is similar to that, as you notice here. The sponsoring church plan, the congregation will select the preacher like Highland or like Otis Gatewood was selected by the church down at Lubbock. The sponsoring church defined the territory. They said, you go to Germany, Otis, and preach to the Germans. And the sponsoring church sent the preacher out. They paid his way to Germany. The sponsoring church paid the preacher. They paid Otis Gatewood. Sponsoring church, the congregation paid, received from the local churches that begged for, and thus it came from the churches of Christ to the Lubbock church, and from Lubbock, then it went over to overseas indirectly to Otis Gatewood. And the sponsoring congregation received a report directly from Otis, and then they sent a report back to the churches that sponsored it. Thus we have the parallel between the Missionary Society and the sponsoring church. So I said again, I wouldn't give you a plug nickel difference between the Missionary Society and the sponsoring church. If brethren had known in time past what was wrong with the Missionary Society, we had never gotten involved in the sponsoring church in the first place. Well, now last we got asked this question. Let me ask it again briefly. Now what part of the oversight can elders delegate? The local church elders are to oversee the members of the flock, the worship of the church, the work of the church, the discipline of the members, and the resources. Because each congregation, now look at the chart, each congregation is autonomous, self-ruling, independent, equal, sufficient to do all that God told it to do. Now, can they turn any of that work over to human organization with a board of directors such as Missionary Society? Can they turn the work of preaching or anything else over to a board of directors for that second body to do the work of the first body? No. Well, can they turn over to a sponsoring church who assumes the work and to be the agent? This human organization is simply an agent of the churches, acting as an agency for them to operate. And the sponsoring church is simply an agency through which all the churches operate. And there's no authority for agency or an agent to exist between the church and its work. So we see that they stand an agent between the work, between the churches and their work. Then, the matter of autonomy again. Notice briefly that what the word autonomy means. The word autonomy means independent in government, self-governing, without outside control. Government. To direct and control the actions or conduct of either by established law or arbitrary will. Is to control or direct the actions, conduct, or operation of, to regulate, influence, restrain, administer. Webster's New International Dictionary. In Acts 14, we find elders are ordained in each church. In 1 verse 1, they're elders in the church. Acts 20 and 28, they're to feed the flock of God. In 1 Peter 5 and 2, is among them, taking the oversight. And so the Bible shows that each local church was autonomous, independent, self-ruling. Now then, to direct independently the operation required by the law, here's Christ, and Christ is the one lawgiver, preeminent in all things in the church as head of the church. His law, therefore, is the governing guidance because it's the perfect law of liberty. And Christ has given to the elders over the church the authority to feed the flock of God which is among you. So no other organization or control, only provision for directing the function is limited to itself. So the function is to edify and is to teach, should be a teacher, should be to teach, edify, and relieve. It's independently organized, independently directed, independently charged. The chart by Maurice Barnett and Gene Frost. All right, and that shows the idea that what's wrong with that Herald of Truth and all sponsoring church systems and missionary societies is that they break the autonomy of the local congregation, take away the authority of the elders, and thus rob the church of that. It's a matter of atonement. Now, is this work that we've been talking about, is it assumed or assigned? Take the Herald of Truth for just a moment again. Now, when they started the Herald of Truth, was that something that got assigned to that local church down in Highland, in Abilene, Texas? Did God assign that one local church the authority to preach the gospel to the whole world and beg every congregation to send money to them to do that work? Did God assign that? Can any local church, is any local church obligated to do more than it has the ability to do? If it can, then any individual can give more than he has the ability to give. Brother W. Curtis Porter, in the lectures at Florida College back in 1961, made that very clear. He said, just for example, at that time, I think Herald of Truth was asking for $1 million a year, more than the Highland Church could themselves give. They wanted to give $1 million a year to preach the gospel, but they didn't have the ability to give it, so they begged other churches to give it to them so they could give it for preaching the gospel. Brother Porter said, "Oh, I'd like to give $1,000 every week to the church where I worship to preach the gospel. But I don't have $1,000 above what I'm giving. I'd like to give $1,000 above what I'm giving. But I don't have $1,000. So I'll just beg individuals and churches to send money to me so I can give $1,000 a week." You get the point? Brother Porter didn't have the ability to give $1,000, and God didn't require it of him. And Lubbock or Highland didn't have the ability to give $1 million for preaching the gospel, and God didn't require it of them. And if they could beg for $1 million, you can beg for $1,000 a week, or whatever you want to beg for to give the church. If not, why not? And brother, that thing laughing. When Brother Porter put out on the board, I could see the parallel so simple that even a child could see, can't you? You can see that nowhere does the Bible require an individual or congregation to do more than it has the ability to do. Is that right? That's what the Bible teaches. All right? So the Herald of Truth and the World Radio down in Alabama, down in Louisiana, what's the name of it? Shreveport. Down in Shreveport, Louisiana, where V.E. Howard preaches. So E.R. Harper started the program here, and V.E. Howard used to preach here. We're still living out. So the World Radio and Herald of Truth are both, the local churches have assumed, not assigned. God didn't assign, they've assumed the work of preaching the gospel throughout the whole world, and they don't have the ability, so they have begged churches to give them money. Now God has assigned the elders the oversight. You'll pull over a little bit for me. God has assigned the elders the oversight the work of the church, limited to the flock among them, not the work of 2 or more flocks. Acts 20 and 28, 1 Peter 5, 1 through 3. No eldership has the authority to oversee, feed, tend, guide, and direct the work of more than the flock of which they are among, and of which they have been selected and appointed and served and overseen. They can't oversee 2 flocks, or 200, or 2,000. And if they did, it'd be the Church of Rome. The Pope is that very thing. The herald of truth is an embryo in beginning, the Pope of Rome. That one church and its eldership is assuming the authority of the Pope of Rome. You see that? See what we're going through? The same thing in principle. Not a bit of difference between the two. And so that's what's wrong with that. Then again, somebody said, now Glenn, you don't understand it, as Guy Wood said, it's not, he said, just a matter of how. The Lord, and I'm going to read some statements on that, we're not going to get it, but all the material I've got, I won't have time to read them anyway, but I've already told you where it's discussed. It's discussed at Garfield Heights in, back in 1956, first of all, in Annapolis, and later it appeared in the Gospel Advocate, and later in the debate with Roy Cogdell in Birmingham. So there's all three places he made the statement. If you want to read it in the Birmingham debate. And there he made the statement to the effect that God has not given a pattern or told us how to preach the gospel. As I said a while ago, the same argument Alexander Campbell made, hadn't told us how, just said go preach, didn't tell us how to preach, and so they assume that it's a matter of how. It's not a matter of how, but it's a matter of organization. No one is demanding that we walk or ride or sail or fly any certain way to go, or preach in the pulpit, or preach on the riverbank, or preach in the church building. It's not a matter of how you preach, whether you preach orally, or whether you preach on your fingers, or preach on the radio. It's not a matter of how, it's a matter of organization, you see. So that is what the problem is. That we have a command to go preach the gospel. I read these all while ago at the beginning of the lesson, so we're not reading them again. But the Bible authorizes the church to preach the gospel. The organization has been specified, the church. So the church is the pillar and ground of the truth. The church in Thessalonica sounded out the word of the Lord. Well, we see then that the church is the one and not the missionary society. So which organization is to preach? The church or the man-made missionary society? Well, it's not a matter of how, for the place has to be obtained. The personnel to do the work has to be obtained. The necessities, seats and chairs and lights and air conditioning and all the things necessary to do the preaching has to be obtained. It's not a matter of how, because whether the church provides the how or whether the missionary society provides the how has to be provided, whether it's the church doing the providing or the man-made society doing the providing. They both have to provide a place, personnel, and necessity, don't they? So which one did the Lord assign? Which one did the Lord say to do it? He said the church that leaves out missionary society, it is trying to rob God of glory where? In the church, Ephesians 3 and 21. All right, in the matter of edification. In the matter of edification, again, we have the same problem. Here, we find the church edify itself, and we find Acts 20 and 32, they can do that with the Word. I commend you to God and the Word of His grace is able to build you up. So, the Lord has assigned the church to edify itself. All right? Now, which one are you going to turn the work over to? We let the church provide the how. The how will be the place, the personnel, the necessities. As you might buy Bibles, you might buy some literature, you might buy a chalkboard, you might buy a white board like this, you might buy a projector chart, or whatever necessity you might use in teaching, and the place and the teachers, you'll find that all this has to be provided, whether the church does it or whether an educational institution such as school, college, or seminary does it. It's not a matter of how, is it? It's a matter of which organization did God specify. God said the church to do it, and thus the educational institution, the schools and colleges, are left out. They're not obligated, or they're not been told to do the work for the churches. All right, take that, Charles. Now then, let's look at the origin of the Missionary Society. This was made, chart was made by Jim Cope, if you'll know who it was made by. I put his name down at the bottom of it, chart by Jim Cope. All right. Brother Cope, several years ago, drew this chart to show the Missionary Society the human plan. And what it is, I wish you could sit all one time. Let me look at the bottom. What actually being done here, he is pointing out that the funds, the dollars, is coming from all these churches. The churches take their money. The human plan is for the churches, and he's got a hopper here. You don't know what a hopper is. He's got him a hopper. And so all the churches just throw their money in the hopper here. That is the delegates in the convention, the society. They have to select the executive board, and they call on all the churches to donate their money, throw it in the hopper here, made all the appropriation, and it went down here in the treasury of the Missionary Society. And then the treasury of the Missionary Society, what they did, they funneled it out. It funneled out then to take care of the bills. That is, the agencies to promote the societies on interest. They had to send men out to get money. You got to raise money to get to send agents out to get the money. And the other thing, they had to pay out for the advertising and so on. They had to pay the missionaries and preaching the gospel. Had to pay the agents. So all this is the thing. So the original American Christian Missionary Society, this is the arrangement that divides Church of Christ all the world back 130 or more years ago. All right, now let's look at what developed from this. What happened was that the churches of Christ, or the churches of Christ, became the Christian church or the disciple of Christ. It divided. The organizational plan of the United Christian Missionary Society caused division among churches of Christ, and out of it came the Christian church and disciples of Christ. Here's the matter of the contributing churches, the fellowship group, the church schools, individual givers. They had their annual meeting, the board of managers, and here who they were, the board of trustees. They had the president, the first one, Alexander Campbell. They had the officers, vice president, treasurer, secretary, legal counsel, advisory council, and other officers. They had their cabinet, they had the divisions of work, and so on to be done. Now notice, go ahead. Go here. Now notice this happened in 1849 at Cincinnati, Ohio. The Christian Missionary Society was formed, it was born. It brought division, the body of Christ, and the majority of the churches were swept from their moorings. Those who opposed the innovation were charged with splitting the church. They said, oh, you're splitting the church. And nowadays, when you preach, as I'm preaching tonight, they say, well, Glenn Shaver is splitting the church. Let me ask you, who split the church over instrumental music? Those who brought the instrument in are those who opposed it. Of course, those who brought it in. And the one that did the splitting here is those who brought in the Missionary Society, not those who opposed it, but those who brought in the unscriptural practice in the first place. So they split the church. And we were, at that time, our brethren were labeled non-old, non-progressive, your old moth-backs, your antis, your legalists. And this opened the gates for the whole host of other innovations that came in afterwards. Instrumental music came, Thursday night communion came, open membership came, women preachers came, and worshiping on observing Christmas and Easter and other things in the Christian church. Today the Christian church is more liberal than the Baptist and almost as liberal as the Unitarian. They'll take people in in fact, one church took some babies in by sprinkling flower petals on them over here in Kansas City, Missouri a few years ago. Infant church baptism of flower petals, and put them in the church as members of the church, the Christian church. One time was the body of Christ. When you open the floodgate, the flood just pours in, doesn't it? Just pours in. That chart is by James M. Kelly, Jesse Kelly. All right? Let's look at this sponsoring church now. Now here's the sponsoring church. It's a parallel. I want to give a parallel to it. We're trying to parallel thing now so you can see it. The sponsoring church, the human plan. Again, this is Jim Cope's chart. He pointed out that the human plan was for the churches, just the members of some of the special churches, sponsoring church. They got together and selected a board of elders. And in this case, the Highland elders for the Herald of Truth were selected. And you remember that the two Jameses that started the Herald of Truth selected the elder to be the one. And money comes from all the different churches to the country. And it goes into the hopper, down the treasury. Pull it, if you please. And in this, you find that the money goes to agencies to promote and to promote and the inner congregations in supporting the Herald of Truth. They spend a lot of money, just people out traveling to do this work, and other things, such as office expenses and so on, and the missionaries that pay the preachers, and they pay the agents. In fact, the traffic elder, other agents, to stir other churches up to support them. In fact, I have a tract in there written by Cecil Willis back a few years ago. At that time, back in '61, I believe it was, 49%, almost 50% of your dollars that went to the Herald of Truth went to just grease this hopper, to grease the machinery, and the other 50% went out here to preach the gospel. Half of your money wasted to just grease that old big machinery running there. And that's one thing wrong with it. It's inexpedient. It wasn't unscriptural. All right, let's look at another thing. All right, now here we have Churches of Christ, the organizational plan of the Herald of Truth. The Highland and 15 other contributing churches, individuals contribute to, and no Highland church contributes to the radio and TV committee for its own bank account. It contributes out of its own treasure to the Herald of Truth. You get that point? Which is maintained the Citizens National Bank of Abilene, Texas. The money doesn't go into their treasury. No, sir. They contribute out of their treasury to the treasury of the Herald of Truth. And they have the radio and television committee. They oversee $1,932,000 in the First State Bank. That's back in 1961. Quite a bit of money, wasn't it? All right, read it a little bit, if you will. Now look at, just as we looked a while ago, at the staff of the Mission Society. Look at the staff here. Here's the advertising staff, the program promotion director, radio publicity director, TV publicity director, managing editor of publication, over here radio TV staff, speakers, radio speakers, researchers, pod coordinator, field men. Over here the controller and office manager, secretary, typist, accountant, bookkeeper. This is what 50% of your money goes for to grease the machinery. And here's the coordinator administrator, here's the advertising agency, and the 5 put on the radio and the TV. They put the gospel on radio and TV, and about 50 cents of your money goes out to preach the gospel. Read a little bit, please. A little more than 100 years after 1849, in fact, in 1952, 103 years later, at Abilene, Texas, a group came together and formed the Herald of Truth. Its organization plan is amazingly similar to the 1849 innovation of the Missionary Society. Like the former, it has brought division to the body of Christ. As in the past, those who opposed it are charged with splitting the church. Everywhere I preach, brethren will say, Glenn Shaver splitting the church, and I preach against unscriptural practices. Let me ask you again. And I've asked my opponents who have met me in debate, I've asked them the question, I said, tell me please, brother, who split the church? The man that brought in the piano over here, or the man who opposed it? You know how they answered that? They observed the Passover. You know what that means? They didn't answer it. They didn't open their mouth. Why didn't they open their mouth? If they had opened their mouth and answered correctly, they said, why, of course, the man that brought in the piano. And I said, yes, and you that brought in the Herald of Truth that wasn't in existence until 1952 are the one that divided churches of Christ today, and not those who opposed them. And they could see the parallel. And they wouldn't answer, they just observed the Passover. I don't blame them, I would too. But if we could have debate once again, I had 22 nights on that kind of. I can have another one. You can find somebody, we'll go 4 nights, 8 nights, where you want to go. I think it'd be good for us to just sit down and talk about it. Because we can find what the truth is this way. Right now you're just hearing one side, you'll hear both sides of it. And then you can see how it lines up. So they charge you to spend the church, and you're, what you're called, Glenn Shaver, they told up at Corning, Arkansas, where my wife was raised, told my wife's mother, Glenn has left the church. I had to start the church there. The church, when I started preaching there back in 43, had 2 men, neither one could carry a funeral sack, and 3 or 4 women, and one of the men get up, they had 2 Johns, John Shaver and John Herman, So one of John would get up and turn the numbers, and Sister Moore would pass the tea, and they'd say it, and I'd preach. But that congregation had gotten so far out with a large church now that they say that Glenn Shaver, who helped them when they had no help, and preached for nothing, doesn't even thank you, said that I have left the faith. Why? Because I oppose the Herald Truth, and Landon Saunders, who is preaching there at that time, who preaches on a part of the radio program down in Abilene, and doesn't even mention the word Christ on his program, does he? Well, that's enough for that. So they call you antis, they'll call you legalists, they'll call you everything in the book to try to get people mad at you. And they get mad at you, they don't even shake your hand. I can go down the street of Corning, brethren whom I've known and ate with and baptized, won't even turn their head and look down the other way when they shake hands with you. Why? Because the preacher, Glenn Shaver left the faith. Glenn Shaver no anti. I'm preaching exactly today what my uncle Bert Shaver preached, what his father Peter Shaver preached, what other preachers preached before me all down. In fact, I'm preaching what Peter and Paul preached in the first century. So I'm in pretty good company. I don't mind it. So this has opened the floodgate again for other innovation. They're literally flooding the church today. And today the church is being flooded, and I don't have time tonight to talk about it, but later on we'll tell you some of the things being done today. In fact, there is now a move on. They're asking for $700,000 more. They raised $1 million. They need $1,700,000. They're going to put in a TV, a radio station, and it's owned by a corporation. The president wrote a letter to the church in Damascus, and behold, I got it. I'm glad I did. It came in the mail Friday. The man put it in my box. It meant for Damascus, but I got it. And I know now what they're after. It's a man-made missionary society to establish a radio station and begging Damascus and everybody else to send us $100, help pay this $700,000 off quickly so we get the thing started. A mission society has been formed on like $700,000 being in operation right now. The president wrote the letter. I've got it. So I don't mind putting my mail in the Church of Christ, stick it in the Rapid Red Church. That's all right. I'll learn something that way. So keep putting it in there. This chart was made by James Kelly back in the 60s. All right, we have to hurry. We've got 15 more charts. And here's the picture of those back in 61 and 2 and 3 that was the head of the Herald of Truth. Since then, they've been fired. I'll tell you about that in a minute. The New Missionary Society, the Herald of Truth, in 1961, one of the elders, W.F. Collier, took over the program. He's an Arkansas boy, born and raised in Arkansas, Brother Collier. He's the administrator or chairman of the Radio and Television Committee. And here is Arnold Watson. He's a coordinator, Radio and Television Committee. Raise those if you will, please. And here are the 5, picture 1 is missing. Here's the 5 field or staff representatives. These men are full-time workers paid for by the Herald of Truth to work to get money for it. That's where your money goes to grease the machinery. That's where 50% of your money goes. First of all, there's Mr. Henderson. He has Arkansas, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Kansas, Oklahoma, I mean. So we're under Mr. Henderson. And then there is these are all 286. Now these 5 men here, there's Brian Howe, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. There's Dale Smith, he's got all these states. And there is Dazzle, he's got these states. And then Pipkin, L.A. Is that the Pipkin up here, or different Pipkin, I guess? L.A. Pipkin has California and other states. I'll read a little bit higher, please. Now, notice that there are 286 key or special workers in the various states, including some shown below. So here are the number of workers, some of the workers. These men are full-time. Besides, they have 286 more working for the Herald of Truth. But how they failed. Brother Collier was fired, and let me just show you what that's talking about. All right, here's the next chart, please. The sponsoring church plan. Now, the Herald of Truth Missionary Society. The churches contribute to the HOT, that's HOT, that's Herald of Truth. And they have their own treasury, their own budget. the elders of the Highland Church. The Highland Church, elders and deacons and members, their budget, their treasury here. They contributed out of their treasury into the treasury of the Herald of Truth. Treasury number 2, budget number 2. Just like all the churches that send money didn't go to Highland Church and its money, it goes to the Herald of Truth money. And they have put a deacon in charge of the Herald of Truth, and that deacon fired E.R. Harper as preacher and fired W.F. Collier as elder. Pretty strong deacon, wasn't he? And the other elders stood behind him. So that's amen, that's right. Go ahead, brother. Sick 'em tied. They let a deacon be in charge of it. Now, if you don't believe this, I've got a whole folder full of material written by E.R. Harper and W.F. Collier. I have their own statements of the whole sordid, messy affair, what took place with this deacon, who's a lawyer in charge of the Herald Truth Mission Society. Well, they've had their problems, haven't they? They've had their troubles. You know all this? Boy, I got a file full of them back there. And so it's rotten to the core. Anything that's wrong and unscriptural gets rotten and more rotten as it goes along. It's gotten so it stinks. It stinks. In fact, E.R. Harper would not debate it now on his life. Guy Woods now wouldn't debate it again on his life. The preachers that defended it 25, 30 years ago won't even raise a voice for it now, but they oppose it themselves. Not because they think it's unscriptural, but because it becomes so rotten and so corrupt. You see. Well, so here then, push it on a little bit, you will, please. Then what happens is that the director here goes out and buys radio and TV time and does the work of evangelism. And so I've asked, raise the chart, please. I've asked in debate, where's the scripture authority, book, chapter, and verse for this type of a human arrangement? And so far, all I've got is Matthew 28, Matthew 28 and verse 19. Go make disciples, or Mark 16, go preach the gospel. That's all I've ever received. And then here's the last chart, the lesson's ours tonight. I didn't have any charts to make. I just made up nothing last a while until I got to talking and I quit. So here's what we have, the last one. Put it down a little bit, you will, please. Where does it become wrong? When does it become wrong? When did it become wrong for Churches of Christ to make contribution to a sponsoring church? Don't care who it is. It might be Rabbit Ridge if they sponsored a work and asked churches to send money to us. To any sponsoring church for this work to preach the gospel or the radio and TV. A case in point would be the Highland Church in Abilene, which is the sponsoring church for the nationwide TV program called the Herald of Truth. According to their claim, thousands of churches are now making contributions to the Highland Church to carry on this huge program. It is wrong for a church of Christ to do this. Or is it wrong? Is it wrong for one church to send their money to the sponsoring church? Is it wrong for 500 to do it? Is it wrong for 1,000? What about 5,000? Will this make it wrong? Will it be sinful if all churches in the country in the Highlands? Where would you draw the line? I invite you to observe the chart. Raise the chart, please. Now here's the matter we talked about. So can one church send money to Highland for them to oversee the work of preaching the gospel for another church? If they can oversee the work of one other church than their own church. The other can oversee 2,000, 2 million, or every church in the world. And if they oversee, if we run down the line, if they oversee all the churches, if all the churches turn money over to them to do the preaching of the gospel, then it becomes the Pope of Rome. See where it's going to? It's going to Rome. It leads to Rome. It leads to Rome. Now, raise it, please. Universal Church Action under one eldership to do the work. That's what it be. And why not all other work? If it could do the preaching of the gospel, why not just turn our work of benevolence, taking care of all the needy, let one church do all that? And why not turn our work of edification, and so that the Highlands Church, for example, just become the Pope of Rome, the one church, like the local church in Rome, where the Pope lives, is the church over all other local churches, you see. Let me draw you a circle, what we're talking about. Here's the church in Rome. The church in Rome. Here's the church over at Rome. So, in Vatican City, the Pope is over that church, and he's over every other church in the world. Every congregation under him. And receive the orders. And so if the Hitherto can do this in preaching. Why couldn't they do it just like the Pope of Rome does, and would go all the way back to Rome like they did in the first, second, third, and fourth, fifth century? Our time is up. We trust in that. Did that help you to see what is wrong? And I have some other lessons. I'm not talking about them now. Next week we'll talk about the matter of the work of benevolence. What's the pattern for benevolence, and how have churches of Christ violated the pattern of benevolence? There's one here tonight. You're not a child of God, and through your former teaching you've learned that the gospel is God's power to save your soul. It's to be preached by every person that we can preach it to. We're to preach the gospel by radio, by television. We're to preach it in the pulpit. We're to preach it by our lives. We're to preach it by tract. We're to preach it in every conceivable means and methods that we can use. Not a matter of how, but the church preaches the gospel. Individuals preach the gospel for the saving of your soul. If you're here tonight and you desire to be saved, won't you come while we stand and sing?